Well, welcome to another Redemption Podcast Extra. I'm Daniel Ross, one of the ministers here at Redemption, and I've got with me today our two fantastic counselors, Annie and Paul. And we're going to do another couple of episodes here, or more than a couple. Couple's two. So we're going to do a few episodes here where we're talking about, we're piggybacking a little bit off the Counterfeit sermon series that we're talking about. So we wanted to do another podcast extra with our two counselors as a way of discussing identity and the root cause of so many issues that we face. So welcome, thanks for being here today. And now that we've got all the formalities out of the way, let's just dive right in. So let's talk about counterfeit masculinity. Our culture teaches men that they gain their value and their worth through their performance on a field or at work or even in the bedroom. So let's keep it PG here. We're going to talk about counterfeit masculinity. So first question I have for you all, and we'll let Annie go first. Ladies go first. So to know what is counterfeit, we have to know what is real. So first, what is the biblical definition of a, quote, real man?
Wow, what a question to, you pick the easy ones.
Thank you for letting her go first.
Well, first of all, thank you for having us. We're happy to be here and excited to dig deeper into really important topics. I think it is such a nuanced topic when we talk about what's the definition of a real man or a real woman. How do we define that biblically? The Bible is a massive book, and you could really start anywhere looking for that. You definitely want to go to Genesis first. I think that Paul, I have a feeling, is going to go there with what I know of him. So I'm going to skip over that piece. Okay. He has a really good portion talking about kind of the role of a man in tending and keeping. And I think that is massive. And I think you do want to start there.
Okay.
But I think to hit a couple maybe high points, we do want to look at what are the examples of manhood in the Bible. And I think you could look at, all littered throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, there's a lot of examples you could look at of different archetypes, different characters that show both what is beautiful and what is scary about living as a man. But I think if we could jump to looking at Jesus, the life of Jesus, that's the second place we want to go. We want to go first to Genesis because that's the foundation, and then to the life of Jesus. And there's so many ways you could take that. Jesus was a leader, but he was tender. He was strong, but he was merciful. He was also a servant, and he was humble, and he was meek, right? He loved, he was compassionate, but he was bold as a lion, right? So he was all of these things combined, and we are not perfect, so we're not going to fulfill all of those things perfectly. But something I see really commonly in the counseling realm is a lot of men in our culture, and I think a lot of cultures, grew up seeing emotional expression as weakness. That's something that was either explicitly or implicitly taught to them through their family of origin or through friends or through school or through teachers or coaches or sports or on, right? And so, I've seen many men come into my office now in their 40s or 50s, and they really struggle with anger, and they don't know why. It's just all of a sudden it explodes on their kids. Or they really struggle with having panic attacks and anxiety, and they don't know why, right? And it can have multiple causes. There can be a lot of reasons why someone is struggling with those areas. But I think a common thing in masculinity is not necessarily knowing the language of emotional expression.
Very good.
And we are created in the image of God. We are created in the image of an emotional God who, if you read through the Old Testament and if you study the life of Jesus, he is embarrassingly emotional, meaning he is not afraid to weep openly. He is not afraid to love the person no one wants to touch, right? He's not afraid to get angry when he needs to, right? So the whole spectrum of emotions. But what a lot of men have experienced in their life is the only emotion that they have been allowed to express is anger.
Anger, yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Right.
And
so,
not even in an appropriate, healthy way. Use more rage often than anger, even I would think.
Right. Yeah.
How do you separate rage and anger from one another?
Amplified anger, amplified inappropriate response. The rage is whenever you start losing that rational control. Anger can be very rational, can be very appropriate, can be very healthy, can be very unhealthy as well. But rage is seldom an appropriate response unless it's talking about the flight or fight, unless it's a last resort emotion. So the other thing about anger on that is that anger is never a primary emotion. It's always at least a secondary emotion, and we men are terrible about identifying that first emotion to the point that we may be totally oblivious of it. And it may only register with us, and it may never even register consciously with us. It may be completely subconscious, and then the anger follows that for example, one that I would say I relate to, and most other men would be abandonment or the fear of abandonment, or probably even the more accurate one for almost all men universally would be disrespect. And often that disrespect is our version, our interpretation of what that disrespect looked like. We may be encountering someone that grew up in a culture or a family or a system that what they're saying or doing is not disrespectful in any way, shape, or form. It's battering. It's just sparring back and forth, friendly, or they think in their impression, in their mind, that it's a friendly exchange between two people, but it triggers something inside of me. And my interpretation of what's being said or presented registers as disrespect for me. And unfortunately, most of us men don't have good, healthy coping strategies for dealing with that once we feel disrespected. And then it goes from maybe joking and playing around to this feeling of anger, and if not dealt with appropriately, and that can move into rage in just a really short period of time. Or it can be just a really slow burn that takes days, weeks, months even for that to manifest or be presented, and that it's just an internal versus an external, especially, if I'm a kind of a people pleaser and if I'm passive aggressive, then you may not even see or experience my anger for a long time till it manifests into the appropriate response for me, and often just creates more confusion and more bewilderment on why it was going on with that. So overall, as simple as we men are, and I believe we're pretty simple creatures, there's some complexity in the way that those emotions get played out. And one of the examples I'm going to use in a second, and that would be my brother Peter, the disciple Peter. What a complex fellow that just plays out every emotional facet that you can possibly play out. And a lot of times it's circumstantial, and a lot of times it's something he's already preconceived in his mind, but it gets triggered by either by Jesus' righteousness or the circumstances that they're encountering, or that he perceives that they're encountering.
So before we ask you what your definition of a real man is biblically,
Yes.
Did you have anything else to add to that first question?
Well, I just think it's a common, I think, barrier to men really stepping into their full identity. Because in order to have a true biblical
Absolutely.
definition of masculinity, you are first and primarily an image bearer. And Paul will talk about what that means in Genesis, but in terms of your emotional life, which is such a common problem, like I said, that I see with men, that really has to be explored and delved into, I would say, first among the first few things. If someone is looking to grow in becoming more of a man after God's own heart, you have to look at your emotional life, because if you don't, there's consequences to that. And we can probably get into more of that in a little bit, but a lot of the compulsive behaviors come out of things being trapped inside. So not a great example is just lust and not understanding how to manage those feelings or those urges, and not even being in a society that gives you language for that, or a family that may give you language for that. And so I think that is a great starting place for how do we move into biblical manhood. You have to understand your own emotions, be able to process those, and then deal with them in a healthy way, right?
Great.
So let's talk about Genesis.
So exactly, to follow up with Annie's sharing on that, which was outstanding. So ultimately, like you so brilliantly put forth to start with, often to understand the counterfeit, we have to see the real thing, right? It'd be almost impossible to pick out a counterfeit $100 bill if you'd never seen a real $100 bill, right? You would think the counterfeit would be the real because you wouldn't have the true perspective to identify what's counterfeit about it. And it's the same way with us in our humanity. And anybody that's ever spent any time around me knows that I absolutely love the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And in that, it's just amazing. And I don't know how many hundreds of times I've read that and shared that, especially in counseling. It's always in premarital counseling, and always when I'm doing marital counseling, we go back to the basics. We go back to the Genesis. And one of the greatest aspects of Genesis is way early, being the first book of the Bible, and then you're in the first 3 chapters of the Bible, and right after God describes how he created everything, he describes how he creates us, and he describes the garden, and he describes how he created Adam, and he puts Adam in the garden and gives us a fairly detailed description of how he just took dirt. And, for us, Ben, whenever we hear you're dumb as dirt, I take that as a compliment, because God crafted me out of dust, out of clay, out of dirt, and he formed me into this being with the Spirit, and that's a pretty amazing thing. But when we read about Adam, what did he said God created Adam for a purpose and a plan, and that purpose and a plan right off the bat was to tend and keep. Well, tend and keep what? He created Adam, in my understanding, perfectly, absolutely perfectly. And he created the garden perfectly. But even within the garden, there was potential pitfalls, right? There were things that were going to cause problems for us through the entire time that we live on this planet until we move into the heavenly realm. We've got that problem, and that problem is evil. That problem is the serpent. But God also creates that. And then for people that haven't really spent much time reading that, one of the most shocking aspects of Genesis, when he describes the serpent, and he says he's craftier than any wild beast that he created or formed. So that kind of sets us in motion. He created Adam perfectly, and he put him inside of a perfect garden. Now, for me, I love that, because I think that's the greatest, simplest form of who we are as men. How complicated do we have to be perfect, to tend and keep a perfect garden? I don't even know what you do all day. If you're created perfectly in a perfect garden, you just watch it, I guess, and you tend to it and you keep it. But it's a pretty simple task. And I think God created us incredibly simple in the way that he crafted Adam. And immediately, the next verse after, well, 2 verses after he creates Adam, puts him in the garden, tells him to tend and keep it. He says, I love it. He says, yeah, maybe it's not so good that Adam be alone. So, and it's humor, but it's funny, but it's so true. It's so true. Yet there might be somebody circumstantial who say, yeah, boy, better off alone. But in general, especially if there are couples in there, I'll ask, I say, is it good for him to be alone? And immediately, probably 95+% of the time, immediately, no, it's not good for him to be alone. And then I'll ask him, do you think it's good? No, it's really not good for me to be alone. And there's just something so deeply imprinted in who we are, who God created us to be, that it's not good for us to be alone, and that we do need a comparable helpmate. So, it's a perfect combination, and I love Genesis about that, and we'll talk about Eve as the perfect comparable helpmate as we go into the next series here. But the other part of that is, again, how do you know the authentic? Well, Christ is always going to be, and you've said it much better than I could ever say it, of his manhood. He was perfectly 100% man, and he was 100% God. So we're all going to fail and fall short of Christ's example. And for us men, immediately, the word fail comes into there. And failure to us men is unacceptable, almost universally, almost unanimously, almost all the time. That the second we hear failure it goes back to Genesis again. But when you compare us to Christ, Paul says we all fall short. So when you go back to that, the last verse of chapter 2 is that Adam and Eve stood naked. It doesn't say it, but it's implied, in front of God, and were not ashamed. So the failure is linked to shame, and we don't have an antibody to failure or to shame. We don't. We didn't need it. We were in the garden. We were in a perfect environment. We were created perfectly, and sin hadn't separated us from God yet. But the second sin, oddly enough, on the next page in history, in our Bible, the very next page is the fall. And one of the very first things that we experience then is shame, and we're not equipped for it. We just are absolutely ill-equipped or unequipped, maybe even better. But we don't know what to do with that. And immediately that brings failure into our hearts and our minds. And for most of us, unless we have somebody with a really healthy perspective on life, we live into that tendency to live up to that failure and hence live into that shame. And it just is so negatively impactful in most of our lives. So we look past that, and of course, in preparation for this, Daniel did a great job sending us some notes on that. And in preparation of this, so I went through the Bible and I looked through every male figure I could kind of look through, and I noticed every one of them has major flaws. Right. Some of them are just flat out character flaws, some of them integrity, some of them are, like David, God says, a man after my own heart. You would think he would be as pristine and pious as anybody that ever lived. He was an adulterer, murderer, besides all the wonderful things that he did. But boy, that gives me hope in the masculinity arena, because, and David feigned being insane at one point in his life. He was a character. You talk about some counterfeitness in there. He did a lot of different things throughout his life, but my favorite, and we can get back to that as we go through the questions, but my favorite in there is Peter. My goodness gracious. When you look at I was reading a note on that. It said Peter's the second most named name in Scripture behind Christ himself. And,
Wow.
that makes sense because he's there. He's there at every scene, almost every turn. Sometimes it's just this bold bravado, tender and keeper. And other times, Christ is calling him out and saying, "Get behind me, Satan." And I think that part of our nature as a man, is extremely confusing when you see that from the outside, and it's extremely flawed looking from the outside. But the truth of it is, I relate to Peter on so many different levels. When he right in the garden when he says, let's gather up a bunch of swords. And Jesus is like, no, I think one will be fine. I want to be sufficient. But he still lops off an ear with that, before Christ can slow him down. But Christ heals that, redeems that, and fixes that mistake. And boy, and that doesn't even lead us into the Jesus who, I don't know anybody named Jesus.
Yeah.
Right.
And then to one of the most powerful scenes, and that is, Peter, do you love me?
Yeah.
I'm, as of yesterday, 66 years old, and it brings tears, makes my voice crack whenever I hear that intimate confrontation between true, perfect masculinity and our fallen masculinity is, do you love me? You know I love you, but in my broken, messed up way, I love you.
So the answer is Jesus.
Jesus, absolutely.
The answer to question one is Jesus. You both said it. I mean, you talk about Adam, and he is, like, as Tim Keller used to say, the true and better. Jesus is the true and better Adam.
Yes.
So, as we look at Christ as our biblical definition of what a man is supposed to be, we, as you mentioned, we do fall short of God's standard for us, which is Jesus. So what are the consequences of that happening in our society? What's the consequences of men living in a counterfeit way?
Consequences at every level, right?
Yes.
Paul and I were talking about this earlier because, if someone is living in a counterfeit way, at least from a societal perspective, initially they may not see many consequences because you could get really praised for living for counterfeit things. If you're chasing after a career, if your idol is your career, the world praises that,
Right.
right?
Right.
If you just want to, conquer as many women as you want, the world will praise that for a period of time. And then things start catching up with us, right? It's somewhere in there. It always goes haywire. And that's because idols will always lie to you. They'll always lie to you. They'll always tell you they're going to give you the world, and then it's bait and switch. And then your world fractures. If you have made career your idol, what about your kids? What about your wife? What about your friends? What about your God, your true God? All of those things. And so the fractures can start at every level. So I live in a city outside of Jasper and has a very high poverty rate. And one of the pastors in the city met with the mayor and asked him, what's the problem in our city? Why is the poverty rate? It's double the national average. What's going on? And the mayor said, well, we have to fix fathers. We have to fix fathers, right? What a massive endeavor and undertaking.
Right.
But there's truth to that.
Oh,
there's
my
truth
goodness,
to that,
yes,
right?
absolutely.
If the father is not intact, then the family fractures, right? And so what are the consequences at every single level? Kind of back to what I was saying earlier, and Paul was kind of piggybacking on, is emotionally, if a man can't understand what's going on in his own heart, that can come out in compulsive ways, right? And so he doesn't know how to connect with his kids, or he doesn't know how to handle lust, or he doesn't know how to handle anger, and so that can create a man who's very, very hurting, very lost, and doesn't know how to get out of that trap, right?
Absolutely.
And so then we're talking about fathers and husbands and people who are leading businesses and who are really struggling and then don't know how to get out of that space. So what are the consequences? Massive, Massive.
Great stuff, Annie. So, I'll tell a real quick little story about Counterfeit because it's kind of interesting to me and kind of funny. I used to work for a major retailer several years ago, and I was doing customer service, and you exchange a lot of money in a day's time, and I got through with my day, and I was in my office, and they called me and asked if the FBI could come talk with me.
That's always a fun
That's
day.
not a good day. That is just not a good day. And of course, I was like, what do you say? Yes, no, I'm not here. Sorry, tell them to come back later. So the FBI comes up and they introduce and show their badges and do their FBI stuff. And of course, it's always pretty intimidating. And then one of them reaches in a briefcase, pulls out a folder, and it has $100 bill inside of a sheet protector. And he says, Mr. Alvey, did you take this $100 bill? And I was like, I don't know. I take a lot of $100 bills. Well, you took this one, Mr. Alvey, and this one's counterfeit. And I'm like, oh no. So they walked me through, and the reason that illustration is so funny to me is it looked good. It looked really, really good. And then that was back before they had the little markers. They could tell whether it was authentic or not, or reasonably well. And, and he walked me through it and showed me there are a lot of different markers on a $100 bill to authenticate that it's an actual real bill. And of course now they're different than they were then. They have the strips in them and all that kind of stuff. But back then it was fairly easy to, especially once color printers came out, it was pretty easy to counterfeit that. So the reason I bring that back up again is this: counterfeit in the context of the business that I was running was significant. If you took 1,000 of those counterfeit $100 bills, it was going to drastically impact the profitability of your business, and which was going to then potentially impact the price of groceries, the amount of employees, and all that kind of stuff. So being counterfeit may look identical. It may seem identical in the short term, like you were saying, and there might not be any. How they tracked that dollar bill back down to me in that particular store, I was pretty impressed with it. But the potential, just the same way as if I'm acting as a counterfeit man in any one of the roles that I play, may not show up short term, but long term could have a devastating, because every transaction that I have with my family, if it's counterfeit, it may not show up immediately. I may look like the most loving, caring, competent, committed husband there ever was, but long term it's going to show up as a character flaw or a flaw in some way that I present to my family. So it's huge, and it's easy, And Peter, again, to go back to the Peter example, it would be easy immediately once Peter says, I will never leave you, Christ. I will never betray you. I will never leave your side, in my interpretation. And Peter's just adamant, I won't. Mm-hmm. But Jesus immediately says, Peter, that not only will you, by the time the cock crows 3 times, you will have done it. Now, that looks counterfeit from the outside, right? Well, Peter was just running his mouth, but I believe that Peter truly believed that, and I think that was authentic. He didn't have enough maturity and character and aspects to live into the promises that he was making, because he had no way of predicting the magnitude and the scope of what was ahead of him. Christ knew perfectly, again, would have looked maybe counterfeit. Some people would say that and stay with that. I would say that was probably he was in an arena that he wasn't mature enough for, prepared for. He thought he was. Some people might say that that's counterfeit, but I think he was being authentically Peter and doing the best that he could. And I love that where Christ comes back and redeems that. But just absolutely adore that part
And
of it.
Peter's response to that being restored shows that he was living in a way that was not counterfeit as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And not only that, but look at the way he was able to live into that once that was revealed, and once Christ had redeemed those imperfections in him. And wow, what a Peter the rock, Petra, built the church on that, and how amazing.
Well, we can go down a lot of rabbit trails here,
Absolutely.
but for the sake of time and brevity, let's just look at how the church can come alongside men to help them live authentic, godly lives in a way that's authentic, authentic and not counterfeit. So what can the church do? What can we do? And we all know that we, as the people, are the church, so it's not an institution thing, but what can we as brothers and sisters do to help men live lives of authentic masculinity?
I would jump up for that one. We had a staff meeting this morning and just listened to Daryl just talk about it. He talked perfectly into the segment to the staff about living with authenticity and living in community and living, a bold, committed relationship. And I am so proud to be part of the staff of Redemption Church. I think Redemption does one of the best jobs in this area. And there are a lot of really good churches that do a lot of really good work, but Redemption is so intentional about the programming that we offer and encourage, and I think we're even just getting better about that each and every day. And I think that's an ongoing conversation at Redemption, and that's one of the things that I just absolutely adore, not just the Jasper campuses, but Tell City campus and the Lagodi campus as well. I think it is an expectation that we commit to exploring what that means to live in a genuine Christian, manly life for us men, and what it means to be a brother, what it means to be a father, what it means to be a husband in that. And as Daryl was talking this morning, it was just a really moving discussion that he had about it matters, and all that stuff matters. And I think we're moving into a season where we're seeing a resurgence of that. And that's not to cast blame or say anybody's bad or wrong or anything. We just, as a nation, I think, kind of lost focus. And Daryl was talking about there being a resurgence in that, a recommitment, a redefining, a reliving into what Christ is calling us to do, and how he's calling us in to live. And if you're not in a group, if you're not connected, if you're not in some type of fellowship group where men, the iron sharpening iron, where we can kind of talk about it, Satan loves nothing, especially for us men. Satan loves nothing better than to get us isolated.
Isolation.
Oh my gosh, it's just we're vulnerable. We're always vulnerable, but we're extremely vulnerable when we get isolated and we lose focus, especially if our only connection is with what the world says is an acceptable standard on that. We're missing it, and in my opinion, we're living out our life with the lowest standards and expectations of what God's calling us to. And we all have the potential to do better than that. We all have I think, an urge and a drive, and we might have a fear that holds us back from moving into that fully, but just do it. One of the other things, Annie, if I may, real quick, Daniel, and I've mentioned this before, David Siemens was a professor at Asbury Seminary, one of the greatest, best-known people in his day. He's passed, and I think his son, whose name was David as well, has come on and written several books, but a great book. It's Healing for the Damaged Emotions. It is a great book. It's one of the early books. I don't know how old this is. I'd say probably 35 years or so.
And for all the men who are listening to this, who use the phrase, I don't like to read, I have great news for you. It's on Spotify as an audiobook. So
And
There you
it's
go.
an easy,
Excuse removed.
outstanding, great job. And it's an easy listener, an easy
It is,
reader.
yeah.
And we all do that, I think, especially. Thank you for saying that. But this one I think this was the first time I ever heard a man when I had him for class. This was the most coveted class at Asbury whenever I was there was David Siemens. And boy, you talked about young men and not so young men, their lives being transformed all of a sudden when we had, Annie, when you had mentioned that earlier, when we started having an understanding that there were more than three emotions, which I think every man out there is going to relate to. That was one of the hardest transitions I ever had, was learning that happy, mad, and sad were not the only three emotions. And I fought that with everything I was worth, okay, abandonment might be one. I don't know, or hurt or whatever. But great book, easy book, and thank you. Spotify, I think I'm going to go back and listen to that again. So good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, or I think you said it all, I just maybe underline it, emphasize it, is that we heal in the context of relationships, right? So
Yes.
that's how we are designed. God designed us that way. So there's no getting around that. You can try, you can read all the books by yourself.
But
You
I just want to do it myself.
and so many people do, and because it's very vulnerable, it's very shameful, it's very scary, it feels very messy to open up to anyone on this earth, right? So a lot of people try to deal with it themselves, or they say, well, just between me and God. Just between me and God. Well, did you read his book? Because he told you that that's not going to be it. That's not how he designed us.
I missed that part.
Right? Right.
Where was that? Where was that at?
Right. So we heal in the context of relationships, right? And it has to be God and community, not God or community, God and community. And if you don't have community, start with counseling. Start there. That's a great place to start. If you do have community, great. Then be more vulnerable. Challenge yourself to talk more about what's going on, because we all have stuff going on, right? And I know that that can be hard for men specifically to open up. Women are a little more, in this specific what we're talking about, are a little more, they're easier with themselves in terms of vulnerability. We have other struggles, but in this lane, there's more of a sense of vulnerability among women. But what one man can start a revolution. If one man is vulnerable, others will come alongside in a community group, in a discipleship group, one-on-one with a mentor, or if none of that is in your life, start with counseling. That will open the floodgates in a
Absolutely.
good way.
Yeah, and I just think one of the things we hope to do with these podcasts is to, I heard one of our staff members say it, we need to normalize counseling. And I think that there's so often, like we were having this discussion the other day, I'll just be honest, my wife and I have been in counseling for 5 years now, and it's one of the best things we've ever done. And when we first went in, it was, the thought is you only do that if your life is a wreck, or
Yeah.
if there's something wrong with, quote unquote, wrong with me,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I think that philosophy still, or that stigma still exists out there. So I hope with these podcasts and with talking about it and being honest about it, we can normalize counseling. We can normalize being able to get help and be able to find somebody to talk to. And I'm glad you mentioned all the things, like community groups that we have. We have, especially for men, we have regular men's breakfasts. We have Advance, and we're not here to plug all the different ministries of the church that we have, but finding one of those things. And again, there's myriad excuses to not do it, but as we've talked about today, the consequences of isolation are devastating, not only for individual lives, but for families and workplaces and then society as a whole.
Amen.
Yeah.
I was listening to a broadcast. I love listening to Thy Word Network, but one of the programs on there said we are currently so hung up on male toxicity, the toxic masculine male, and he said, let's just be truthful in this. We're all toxic in some degree, in some level. And I thought that's absolutely true. It's not that there's not a toxic masculine aspect, because there is, but each one of us, every aspect of our lives has a toxic aspect to it. So if you're feeling isolated, if you're feeling less than, if you're feeling vulnerable, the last thing that you want to do naturally is reach out to another person, because that shame just it beats us. But if you're feeling that, that's your signal. That's your sign.
Shame is so destructive.
Oh,
I mean,
gosh.
I finished reading a 600-page book on the biography of the band Nirvana. And I know this is wild, and you guys probably have no idea what I'm talking about, but so much of what ran through the principal songwriter, Kurt Cobain's life, was shame. It poured out in his lyrics, and ultimately it was totally destructive and devastating to his life.
Yeah.
And I see that so often, and it creeps in, and it may creep in from trauma when we were kids. It may have come in as an adult, but regardless, it's so destructive.
But Daniel, just a quick question on that. I love your commitment to reading. That is impressive. I love it. I wished I was more committed to that. But even with this individual, the shame is so pervasive, and it's so deep, and it's so intimate, and it's so personal. But then it can also become an idol.
Right.
That it helps define who we are, and in the absence of that, we don't have an identity. Right. And then what do you do? What do you do with that? That's a trap. That's a bad, which sounds like it had pretty severe consequences in the outcome of his life, right? So, but there's a lot of people out there that are listeners that are in some variation of what you just so eloquently described. So call, reach out, find a friend, phone a friend. Yeah. Just connect some way. It changes things. Because it's so easy when we're isolated to buy into the evil one's lies. It's just, he's a counterfeiter. He looks like the real thing, sounds like the real thing, but he's not.
That's right.
And it's so easy to take that counterfeit $100 bill and run with it, and you've got nothing.
Yeah.
Except the FBI knocking on your door, which you don't want.
Well, that seems like a great place for us to stop the conversation on counterfeit masculinity, and then next week we're going to get into counterfeit womanhood, and we're going to talk about counterfeit relationships and parenthood or parenting. So thanks for being with us for this episode, and we're going to be back again next week.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.